Well, howdy, everybody in the Community 100. Welcome to Church History with moi. Glad everybody could join us today as we start looking at church history and the life of Martin Luther. Hopefully the sound is a lot better this time. I worked on it in the little bit of a break we had between systematic theology and church history, and as we continue looking at things this morning. Hopefully I got the schedule right. With that, let's jump right into Martin Luther. If you guys can hear me and everything's coming through, make sure you make a comment so I can see it and make sure everything is okay. With that, you guys should be able to hear me and everything should be okay. That's what happens when you move offices and hook everything back up. And for some reason, it wasn't where I was supposed to be. Sounds like a lovely morning so far. Alright, let's dig right into it. Looking at Martin Luther and his early life, his years that he was alive is 1483 to 1546. Born to Hans and Margaret Luther. Now, once again, like with many languages, especially during this time period, there wasn't necessarily a standard spelling or a way of spelling. Martin Luther, there's 3 or 4 versions of spelling his name. The earliest version being Luther, L-U-D-E-R, was sent to Latin schools run by what was called the Brethren. So these were lay people who wanted to help educate the common people. What's interesting is that Martin Luther would later write that he felt himself being of common stock, that he felt as though he was poor. When in all actuality, we would look at Martin Luther and his background. His father being involved in mining and in trade. They were more apt to be called middle to upper middle class individuals during his time. So I don't think he necessarily is right in presenting himself that way. Unlike many that were around him in abject poverty, his father had a substantial amount of money at times, in which he was not necessarily the beneficiary of, but others certainly were. This school taught grammar, rhetoric, and logic, not necessarily mathematics or sciences, but it was more of the thinking man's school. That in order to read and to write, for them to be able to articulate themselves and to be able to use their minds in order to do so. Martin Luther records his early years in going to this Brethren school as being purgatory and hell because of early hours and living at the school, waking up and being taught to memorize and to regurgitate things in so many ways. Oh, that's interesting. In 1501, a young Martin Luther at 17 goes off to the University of Erfurt. Originally, his father really wanted him to go into law and was willing to pay to help his education. He received his master's degree in law in 1505. In July 2nd of 1505 comes what we might call the infamous story. Now, these stories, some of which are written down by Luther, some of which are recorded by others, some of them are legend, says that he was caught in a storm riding horseback running through Germany. and he was almost struck with a bolt of lightning. Some say it hit a tree, some say it hit the ground near him. But in the midst of that storm, it was bad enough that he begins to pray. He thinks that he's going to die. He says, "Help, St. Anna," who is the patron saint of miners, going back to his upbringing and his dad being in the mining business. "I will become a monk. If you save me, I will become a monk." He survives that evening, and he enters St. Augustine's monastery in Erfurt, the 17th of July, 1505. And as was the tradition in those days, when you showed up at the monastery door, any earthly possessions that you had with you, that you carried with you, stayed at the door. You entered with the clothes that were on your back, and then were given your garb of a monk to begin your training and to begin your service. So we see it only takes him a few days to settle his affairs. Here, being basically what we would call a lawyer, not having a practice, but being a lawyer, and now entering into the monastery to become a monk. His father was so mad in his decision between the July 2nd and July 17th. The last time he saw his father before going into the monastery, he said, "This day you see me, and then not ever again." His dad, who had spent a considerable amount of money for his education in law, now doesn't have his oldest son being a lawyer, going against his wishes, which Martin Luther would write later in the topic of specifically vows and monks leaving being a monk, and whether or not it's right for them to abandon their vows. Writes and says that it was wrong of him to disobey his father's wishes because of a prayer to St. Anne. And then obviously his theology changes later to where he believes that the prayer was invalid anyways. That the only prayer that is valid is to God, and that because he prayed to St. Anna, it was invalid. He was praying to the air, so to speak. So that his disconnect from his father, which only lasted for a short number of years during his lifetime, was his fault. And I think in reading and understanding his heart, I think he was right in believing that he was wrong in not obeying his father, even at that young age, to go into the monastery. But God works out all things out in his plan. Luther writes during this time, "I lost touch with Christ, the Savior and Comforter, and made of him the jailer and hangman of my poor soul." While he's in this monastery for months, he lost touch with who Jesus really was. And instead, during this time, it was written both by Martin Luther and his confessor that he got in touch with the vastness and the depth of his sins, that he would beat himself multiple times daily to the point of bleeding and having physical issues, many of which Luther would later write and talk about his many digestive issues. To read Martin Luther is to be, if you have a weak stomach, don't read Luther, as he talks about his digestive issues that were probably caused by this period of time, by his self-deprecation and by his not eating for many days and his continued beating of himself, in which he viewed Jesus as this jailer and hangman, that if he didn't do these things, he was going to end up in purgatory for all of eternity. Luther was ordained in Erfurt at the cathedral in 1508. Von Staupitz, the first dean of the newly founded University of Wittenberg, which we talked about previously, sent for Luther to teach theology. He received a bachelor's degree in biblical studies in 1508 and a bachelor's degree in the sentences, in other words, in what we call that bachelor's degree in letters, in 1509. In 1512, he was awarded his Doctor of Theology, in which during that time, hey Sheldon, let me know if the audio is good, in which he then, at that time, in order to be able to debate or to have conversations about theology and be considered reasonable or even applicable to talk about these things, you had to have your doctorate degree, in which allowed him to go teach at the university. This enabled him to have conversations with Cardinal Cajetan and others later that he would have been just discarded as a nothing, as just some monk somewhere, if it weren't for the fact he had his doctoral degree. This we call it a modern phenomenon of education in the church is actually not modern. For at least 700 years in the church, there's been this requirement to have a high level of education, a master's degree, a doctorate degree, etc. Okay, audio's good. Yay. I'm glad I fixed it. And that's why I'm, Lord willing and the creek don't rise, finishing my THM degree within the next couple of months, and then on to my doctorate degree. Because unfortunately in the world and often in the church, no one will really listen to you until you have that piece of paper. He was made a provincial vicar of Saxony and Thuringia by his religious order in 1515. This meant he was to visit and oversee each of the 11 monasteries in his province. This is where Martin Luther picks up what is called his first benefice. As if you remember our previous lesson, a benefice was income for priests and bishops that comes to him, and out of that monies that come to him, he is able to then hire a priest or another type of clergyman to take that position, and then still be able to receive money from that for him to be able to do things that he needs to do. So, for instance, teaching at the university, he had to go visit all of these different monasteries and churches. He didn't have the time for that and teach at the university. So he needed to have under shepherds, so to speak, come in to take care of those benefices so that he could continue not only his research, but his writing and his teaching. In 1507, Luther celebrates his first Mass, and as he does so, he stops before he utters the words of consecration. Hoc est corpus meum. This is my body. Now, we have to remember, we've talked about this once before when we talked about communion, but each priest, since about 7th or 8th century, are ordained as alter Christus, alternate Christs, who stand in the place of Christ to transubstantiate the wafer and the cup into the body and blood of Christ. That literally during their ordination, it said that their souls are marked. There's a tab put on their soul that even if they leave the church, even if they become a heretic, they still have the power to transubstantiate the bread and the wine into the body and blood of Christ. Martin Luther, being sharp and understanding the words that he was saying or going to say, stops. He freezes at his first Mass as a newly minted priest. The thing is that his dad's in the audience. And his dad, who's now back into a relationship with Martin Luther, has given quite a bit of money to the church and to his order. And now here he's supporting this church, and now his son can't even, do communion right, in which that created a schism between the two for a little bit of time. But Luther already at this point is starting to have a problem with the theology. And specifically in this case, in early Luther, he was having a hard time understanding of how unrighteous he is being able to handle the body and blood of Christ. How is it that in his mind, this peasant, can be the one in whom, at that time, he still considered it calling down God into the form of the bread and the cup? He had a right to think about these things. Luther was no dummy. As Staupitz, his father confessor, writes about him being extremely smart, and that's why Staupitz is one of the ones who continues to push him to getting more and more education, because he sees potential in young Martin Luther. His father is humiliated as he is donating large sums of money to Luther's churches and to the college. College of Wittenberg, their very early donors and sizable donors was Martin Luther's dad. Now we come to probably one of the most important events in Martin Luther's life, his trip to Rome. He has to go on church business to represent the monastery in a legal dispute. And he is the one who is chosen to go. Probably because of his previous education in law, and that he is now a doctor of the church, as they say. He walks the 700 miles in winter over the Alps to go to Rome. Remember, his order, a monk specifically, All right, I'm back. His order specifically would not use donkeys or horses or carriages. They walked everywhere. And so Martin Luther has to make, in order to represent his monastery, has to take the long 18 to 20 month journey, the 700 miles total round trip, to Rome in winter. He gets to Rome and he's amazed at what he sees. He's all excited about the grandeur and religiousness of Rome. But while he's there, he's quickly disillusioned. Luther visited the Scala Santa, or the Holy Steps, supposedly brought back from the Holy Land and believed to be the very steps that from Pontius Pilate's palace that Jesus climbed on the day he was convicted. Luther joins the crowd and made his way up, many of which on their knees, stopping at each step and praying the rosary as they go up, saying the Lord's Prayer on each step, and the pilgrim's reward for this climb, a fewer years in purgatory for each of those steps. When he reaches the top, Luther stood up and was thinking, is this actually true? Is what I just did mean anything? We're going to get into the concept of relics and the relic trade that Martin Luther sees in Rome. But Martin Luther is starting to piece together all of these extraneous religious things as he experiences them in Rome that leads them to a disillusionment with the church. While Luther is there, he sees the Italian priests, and it's almost as though there's one on every street corner performing masses for people for money. Because if you're able to purchase a priest to do a mass, he's able to then give you an indulgence to help earn time off purgatory. So then the priests aren't dumb. If I can make a few bucks off of this one person who needs masses done for purgatory, if I do them very, very quickly and in quick succession, I can make a lot of money off of these tourists. And so Martin Luther records how these priests were many of the times, because Martin Luther is a sharp person, he knows the rites. He's a newly minted priest. He sees them mumbling and skipping large portions of the Mass, many times uttering gibberish just to get through it as quickly as possible and get on to the next one so that they can earn more money for that next indulgence or for that next Mass. He then, in this early trip to Rome in 1510, he sees the vast relic trade. The relics were kept in reliquaries and exhibited once specifically. Luther was no stranger to relics. In fact, at the church in which he served and in the monastery, the benefactor, shall we say, of the monastery and of the church was very proud of his extensive relic collection. And when talking about the relics that were there, he takes an inventory just before he heads off to Rome. And it says, the relics were kept in reliquaries and exhibited once a year for the faithful to venerate. In 1509, each devout visitor who donated towards the preservation of the castle church received an indulgence of 100 days per relic. So if you venerate, in other words, pray to or adore each of these relics, you got 100 days off of your time in purgatory. This would allow person relief of 100 days in purgatory, and thus hasten their entry into heaven. By 1520, Frederick the Great, who was the benefactor of the castle church in Wittenberg, had increased his collection to over 19,000 relics, allowing pilgrims viewing all of them to receive an indulgence that would reduce their time in purgatory if they were able. It was organized by rows. And in each row were so many thousand relics. And you got a bonus time off of purgatory if you prayed and venerated each of those relics in that aisle. So that if you venerated all 19,000 plus the bonus for completing each row, you could get 5,000 years off of purgatory by going to the castle church, donating a large sum of money, and going through their collection and venerating and praying at each of these relics. Some of these relics included, there's a way longer list available online, the thumb of St. Anne, some straw from Jesus' manger. Now, I don't know how straw holds up after 1,500 years, but okay. A twig from the burning bush. That one's another hard one. One piece of bread which Christ ate with his disciples during the Last Supper. One piece of sponge with the Lord was given vinegar and gall, etc., etc., etc. A total of 19,000. Proper veneration of all of these relics, all of them. We saw that one row would get you 5,000 years. If you worshipped all the rows and you got all the bonuses, was 1,902,202 from the time that the soul was destined to spend in purgatory. Martin Luther, after inventorying all of this and writing this down, starts to question the relic trade. Starts to, especially as he's in Rome, there's 19 true nails of the cross. Wait, wasn't there only 3? There's enough wood, supposedly, that were true pieces of the cross that you could make an entire city of them. Just the amount of the relic trade, not only there at the Castle Church in Wittenberg, but as Martin Luther goes to Rome, he sees how big it is and goes, what's going on here? Luther writes, if there is a hell, then Rome is built over it. as he reflects on his trip to Rome. He calls it a cesspit of sin. And in fact, while he's visiting there, Julius II, the current Pope in Rome, is seen wandering up and down the streets in this, here's a movie depiction of this event, in a full suit of armor, carrying a sword and sometimes a spear, riding upon a horse. Luther's questioning is, when he writes about seeing Julius, what was called the warrior pope, he reflects on the fact, as we reflected on last Sunday, that Jesus rode into Jerusalem on a donkey, not for war, but to bring peace. And yet here Julius is the one riding around like a warrior monk. You see the soldiers gathered around him as this warrior monk, warrior pope. And this questioning in Luther's mind as to the reality is all this real? Or is all this just man-made baloney? From 1510 to 1520, once he gets back from Rome, Martin Luther starts teaching and preaching on the Psalms, the book of Hebrews, then the book of Romans, and then the book of Galatians. If preaching and teaching through any three books, especially, will bring you to a fuller understanding as to the nature of salvation, the nature of justification, the nature of sanctification, you go through Hebrews, Romans, and Galatians, and if you aren't changed as to your understanding and the depth of which those realities are, something's wrong. As Martin Luther starts going through these things and is internally understanding the nature and weight of his sin, and now seeing the justification, sanctification that comes in and by faith, and in through the work of Christ, he starts questioning the whole theological system in which he's in. In fact, he comes across Romans 1:17, which is a quotation of Habakkuk 2:4. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith for faith. As it is written, the righteous shall live by faith. This is where, when Martin Luther, while he's in Rome, he learns a little bit of Hebrew from a Jewish rabbi who is in Rome. And he increases his Greek ability while he's in Rome, and he pays for a tutor. He starts to see, we have to remember that this is just now 4 years after Erasmus prints his first edition of the Novum Instrumentum, in which we know Martin Luther uses. And in fact, he sees, because in the Novum Instrumentum on one page it's the Latin and on another page it's the Greek. And when coming to Paul in Romans, Hebrews, and Galatians, when talking about repentance, and we're talking about faith and pistis, Luther notices something different between the Latin and the Greek. He sees the Latin translated potentiam agite, to do penance, the sacrificial system of Rome, which was the official dogmatic position of the church. And in fact, the church at some point had put out their own infallibly translated Latin version, in which Erasmus dare not change potentiam agite for fear of being jailed because of the sacrificial system. Hey there, Chrissy. Hopefully the girls are having fun at gymnastics. And yet on the opposite page, where the Greek is, Paul uses the word metanoiete, a compound word of meta and noieté, which we translate predominantly to repent. Meta, after or beyond, noieté, the mind, after the mind, in the thoughts of the mind, in the choices to, in fact, repent. is vastly different than to do penance and to just merely do the rituals and the offerings and the prayers and all of the religion versus the change of mind and the change of heart that metanoia presents. In its definition as used by most Bible dictionaries, metanoia is a change of mind as it appears to one who repents of a purpose he has formed or something that he has done. He has repented from what he has done in the past, and he's purposed on changing his path and changing his mind. It's not doing penance. This is where when Luther, looking at Paul's writing in Romans and looking at the prophet's writing in Habakkuk 2:4 and realizing that it's not in doing penance, it's by faith through grace. The beginnings of what we would call sola fide, only faith, not through penance, not through religion. In fact, Joseph Noel Patron in 1861 paints this painting that we see here on your screen. He entitled it Discovering the Doctrine of Sola Fide, in which he paints Paul digging through the scripture in Erfurt as he starts to begin to present the case for by faith through grace, what we would know as Ephesians chapter 2, verses 8 and 9. The whole concept of sola fide, by faith, off the back of Romans 1:17 and Habakkuk 2:4. But then something happens. And this is a painting or a drawing in 1530. But the sale of indulgences, which he had seen while in Rome, the masses done, and then those the faithful that had given money to the priest to do the mass as many times and as quickly as possible in order to earn time off purgatory. And as we go back in history, we realize that Julius II, although in a time of peace, his followers, Pius X and others, needed money to wage wars, to gain lands. They needed money because Julius II starts this great renovation project in Rome, which his successors then continue, in which to recreate and to rebuild St. Peter's Basilica bigger and greater and grander than it was before. You got to have capital. You got to have money to do that. And so the popes authorized the sale of indulgences to certain individuals to raise money to build the St. Peter's Basilica. Now with the rise of nationalism, people in countries such as Germany, specifically Saxony, are going, well, why is it that this money is going to Rome when we could be using this money for churches and cathedrals here in Germany? And in fact, in 1560, Johann Tetzel is given special powers by the Pope for selling indulgences, specifically in Saxony, to pay for St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. When Johann Tetzel shows up, he bumps into eventually Archbishop Albrecht, who needs funds himself to purchase this special paper so that he can have several benefices in order to earn money, because he has to pay for it in order so that he can eventually become a cardinal. He has his eyes set on large positions, and he needs money. So he strikes a deal with Tetzel. He says, okay, I'll let you come in and to preach indulgences, but I get a 50% cut. And 50% will go to St. Peter's Basilica. So Johann Tetzel, now with the authority of the bishop, who eventually will become archbishop, and he goes around preaching. Every time a coin in the coffer rings, a soul from purgatory springs. You could purchase indulgences for your loved one that is already passed, or for you yourself. And in fact, a story that has some confirmation but may not be actually true is Tetzel sells an indulgence to a rather rich individual who asks him the question, well, can I buy an indulgence for a sin that I'm going to commit in the future? And Johann Tetzel, being the smart man he is, says, well, it depends on how much money you're willing to spend. And so Tetzel sells this man a rather large indulgence. And as Tetzel is leaving town, he is ambushed by that individual and several other thugs, and who kick him off of his horse and beat the snot out of him. When Tetzel ends up going back to Albright and telling him the story, beaten and bruised and bleeding, the individual that did this ends up getting off scot-free because, well, he's got the indulgence that Tetzel signed and sealed with the seal of the Pope in Rome. And Tetzel ends up just Albright ends up laughing at Tetzel because of his, stupidity and greed. Also, what starts Martin Luther in understanding what's going on at the time, the story is that one of his congregation members was a drunkard. And that Martin Luther finds him drunk underneath a tree. And he goes, why aren't you in church? Why aren't you repenting? And he produces a indulgence signed by Tetzel, in which, at least according to history, Luther shreds and begins to take umbrage with Tetzel. Also, at the same time, the bombastic Pope Julius II, which we saw that movie depiction of him, was in the midst of spending a fortune for an extravagant remodel of his church. In addition, the Pope had hired Raphael to decorate his personal living quarters with elaborate frescoes, and Michelangelo to paint his sanctuary, the Sistine Chapel. Raphael and Michelangelo weren't cheap. And no, we're not talking about the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles either. No, we're talking about the great painters of history's past, and whom still to this day you can see their work in Rome. They weren't cheap. This large expansion was costing a literal fortune every day. We see that as Martin Luther, seeing what Julius II starts in 1510 as he visits Rome, as he bumps into Tetzel and the selling of indulgences, as he notices the own relic trade that's going on there at the Castle Church in Wittenberg, as he sees the relic trade in Rome, Luther is more and more being disillusioned from the Roman Catholic Church, especially as he's preaching and researching and really looking at the Greek of Paul's writings, specifically Romans, Hebrews, and Galatians. He's starting to see the errors of what he had been taught and starts teaching differently in his classes, starts teaching differently in his church, which leads him then, as we talk about next week, to the 95 Theses. To him going, you know what? We need to have conversations about these things. I'm a doctor of the church, quote unquote. Let's have debates. We have to remember that there wasn't a football program or a soccer program at the University of Wittenberg or the University in Erfurt or Luxembourg. Their form of collegiate battles was done in the mind, in and through debates. And so Luther posting these 95 Theses was a way of getting this out in the open. And it wasn't just that now today online you will find most theological debates are 2 to 3 hours long. These debates would often be 3, 4, 5 days long, 8, 10 hours a day. Luther posting these was nothing more than a challenge to the other universities and other quote-unquote doctors of the church to debate these issues. I don't know that Luther would understand how much of a fervor and how much of a hustle and bustle he would create, not only in Germany, but that would reach the rest of the known world. With that, we will start that up next week. Hopefully you guys are blessed in looking at the early life of Luther. There's so much more that we could talk about that it would take more than one episode, but I wanted to really focus on the impetus of the Reformation. And as we look at the early Reformation, mid-Reformation, and then what has happened since the Reformation, I really want to talk about how I think Luther didn't go far enough. About how Luther and Calvin and Zwingli and even the Anabaptists, they didn't want to reform the church to make it a free church. No, they still were thinking of a sacral church, a church that was married with the state, a church that had the backup, both legally and by the sword of the state, in which they were able to determine and to present the power of the church and the majesty of the church. They didn't want just a reformed theology of the church. They wanted another sacral married church. With that, see you guys all here in about 20 minutes for Daylight with Dr. H, hopefully Pastor X, and Pastor Dave, as we start talking about the pastoral implications of counseling when there's loss. With that, see you all in just a few minutes.